The moment Emma Beckett walked through the creaking door of Calloway's trading post in Durango, Colorado, in the summer of 1882, she knew the day was going to cost her more than the few coins pressed into her palm. The trading post sat at the edge of the main road through town, a squat, weathered building with a porch that leaned slightly to the left as though it had grown tired of standing straight. Durango itself had only been incorporated a year earlier, still finding its bones, still deciding what kind of town it wanted to be. The streets outside were rutted from wagon wheels and muddy from a recent rain, and the air smelled of pine resin drifting down from the San Juan Mountains that rose in every direction, blue and enormous and indifferent to the small dramas playing out below them. Emma had ridden in from the Beckett homestead, 12 miles southeast of town, where she lived alone since her father, Amos Beckett, had passed from a fever the previous winter. She was 23 years old, with dark auburn hair she wore pinned under a cream-colored bonnet, and eyes the color of a mountain lake in late September, that particular shade of gray-blue that shifts depending on the light. She was not a small woman in spirit, but she was slender, and years of hard work on the homestead had given her a kind of quiet, weathered grace that men often mistook for fragility. She needed flour, salt pork, a length of canvas to patch the barn roof, and a new tin of lamp oil. Simple things. She had her list written on the back of an envelope in her neat, careful hand, and she had counted out her money 3 times that morning before tucking it into the small leather purse she kept inside her coat pocket. Silas Calloway was behind the counter when she entered. He was a broad man in his early 50s with a thick gray mustache that he kept oiled, and small eyes that had a way of calculating everything they looked at. As though the whole world was an ongoing transaction he was trying to get the better of. He had been overcharging the settlers who came to his store for years, but he was the only real trading post within a day's ride in any direction, which gave him a kind of authority he wore like a second coat. There were 2 other men in the store when Emma came in. One was a young cowhand leaning against the far wall near the ammunition display, picking at the brim of his hat and watching her with the kind of lazy attention young men gave to pretty women they thought might be impressed by it. The other was a man named Doyle Ferris, who owned a cattle operation about 3 miles west of Emma's homestead, and who had been trying to buy her land for the better part of 2 years. Ferris was perhaps 40, lean and sharp-faced, with a voice like a knife being dragged across stone. Emma had barely gotten through her list before the troubles started. "Flour's gone up," Calloway said, without looking at her. He was restacking a shelf of canned goods that did not need restacking. "Gone up," Emma repeated. "It was $1.20 a sack 2 weeks ago." That was 2 weeks ago. He still did not look at her. Emma felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but she kept her voice even. "That seems like quite a jump in 2 weeks, Mr. Calloway. What has changed?" "Supply and demand, Miss Beckett. I don't set the world's prices." Doyle Ferris moved away from the wall and ambled over, his boots heavy on the plank floor. "Well now," he said, in that slow, deliberate way that was meant to sound friendly but never quite made it all the way there. "How are you getting on that little patch of yours, Emma?" She did not miss the way he said little, and she did not correct him for using her first name without permission, because she had learned that arguing with Ferris was like arguing with a weather system. "I am getting on fine, Mr. Ferris, thank you." "Must be awful lonely out there," he said, leaning against the counter beside her. "Woman alone, all that land to manage, doesn't seem like much of a life." "It is my life," she said quietly. "I made you a fair offer last spring," he said. "I'll make it again, might be better than what's coming." Emma turned to look at him fully. "Is that a threat, Mr. Ferris?" He smiled, a thin thing with no warmth in it. "Just good advice." Calloway set a sack of flour on the counter and named a price that was nearly double what Emma had paid in April. When she pushed back on it, citing what she had paid before, citing what she knew other settlers had paid, he simply looked at her with those flat, calculating eyes and said, "You want it or not?" The cowhand by the wall snickered. Emma was trying to decide between the flour and the canvas. calculating which she could do without for another few weeks, when she heard the door open behind her. She did not hear much, truthfully. Just the soft creak of the hinges, the brief rush of summer air carrying pine and dust, and the distant sound of a horse being watered at the trough outside. Then a presence settled into the room like a weather change, quiet but undeniable, and she became aware without turning around that whoever had come through that door was a large person. She heard Calloway's eyes move before she heard anything else. That was the thing about a man like Calloway. You could almost hear when he recalibrated. And then the voice came, low and unhurried, from somewhere behind her and slightly to her right. "That flower is $1.40 at the outfitters in Silverton," the voice said, "and that's with the mountain markup." It was not a threat. It was not even particularly loud. It was simply a fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who was not accustomed to being argued with, not because he was aggressive, but because he was so plainly certain of the ground beneath his feet that uncertainty did not seem to apply to him. Emma turned. Marshall Hale stood just inside the doorway, and the first thing she noticed was how the room seemed to have quietly rearranged itself around him. He was a large man, enormously so, built in the way that the mountains themselves were built, not showy about it, simply there. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to angle slightly through the frame as he came in, and his arms were the arms of a man who had spent years doing work that required the whole body, splitting wood and hauling game and wrestling rivers. He wore buckskin trousers and a dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms roped with muscle and marked with a few old scars. His hair was dark brown, shot through with a little bronze from the sun, and it fell just past his collar in a way that suggested he had not thought much about getting it cut. He had a beard, kept reasonably close, and eyes that were a steady dark hazel. He was, Emma realized with some surprise, not yet 35. He was looking at Calloway with perfect calm. Calloway cleared his throat. "Marshall Hale," he said, in a tone that attempted heartiness and landed somewhere around careful. "Sila's," Marshall said. He did not move further into the store yet. He was simply standing there, having said his piece about the flower, and watching Calloway with the patient attention of a man who could wait as long as necessary. Ferris straightened slightly. Men like Ferris had a particular sensitivity to the gravity of other men, and Marshall Hale had a great deal of it. "The price I gave the lady is fair," Calloway said. "You told her $1.20 2 weeks ago," Marshall said. He had clearly heard more of the conversation than Emma had realized. "Flour didn't double in 2 weeks, Silas, not with prices what they are." There was a long, measured silence. Emma watched Calloway's mustache twitch. She watched the cowhand by the wall stop smiling. She watched Doyle Ferris turn slightly and study Marshall Hale with the cool, interested look of a man filing something away for later use. "Fine," Calloway said finally. $1.30, and that's because you're asking." "She's the one buying," Marshall said. "Give her the $1.20. Another silence, a longer one. $1.20, Calloway said. Emma had not said a word through any of this. She was not sure she had breathed properly. She turned back to the counter and completed her list at prices that were, while not generous, at least no longer insulting. When she reached into her purse to count out the coins, she was aware of Marshall Hale moving into the room, drifting past her with a quiet, "Pardon me, ma'am," as he reached past to pick up a coil of rope from the hook on the wall, as though everything that had just happened was simply the natural order of things and required no further comment. She wanted to say something to him. "Thank you" seemed too small. But when she turned to offer it anyway, he was already in a conversation with Calloway about the rope and the cost of beaver pelts, and he spoke with such easy focus that it felt rude to interrupt. So Emma gathered her purchases, loaded them into her wagon, and drove back toward the homestead with the San Juan Mountains ahead of her, and a feeling in her chest that she could not quite name, something between gratitude and curiosity, and something warmer underneath both of those. She thought about those hazel eyes for the rest of the afternoon. The homestead sat in a wide, shallow valley with a creek running along the north edge of the property, clear and fast from the snowmelt that came down off the high peaks every summer. Amos Beckett had chosen the land carefully, which was one of the few careful things he had ever done. The house was a solid log structure with 2 rooms and a good stone fireplace, and the barn, though it needed that canvas patch on the roof, was well built and housed Emma's horse, a broad-chested gray mare named Rosie, and 6 chickens who had no business being as dramatic as they were. Emma worked the homestead alone and had been doing so for 8 months. She had a kitchen garden that she was proud of, a small root cellar, and a fair skill with a rifle that her father had taught her mostly by accident, since he'd had no patience for formal instruction and had simply handed her the gun one afternoon and told her to figure it out. She grew wheat on 10 acres, which she sold at the grain brokers in Durango, and she kept 2 pigs whose names she tried not to learn but always ended up learning anyway. She managed. That was the word she used when people asked how she was doing out there alone. She managed. It was not a word that left room for the truth, which was that some nights the silence of the valley pressed in from all sides and felt less like peace and more like weight. She was thinking about that weight on the evening of her return from the trading post, sitting on the porch as the sun went down behind the western peaks and turned the sky that particular violent orange that Colorado evenings specialized in, when she saw a rider coming down the trail from the north. She stood up slowly, shielding her eyes with her hand. The rider was Marshall Hale. He came down the trail at an unhurried walk on a big roan horse that moved with the calm economy of a mountain animal that had been many places and was confident about all of them. Marshall himself rode the way he moved through the trading post, settled, without excess, as though gravity and he had reached some private agreement about how things would go. He stopped at the edge of her property and called out in that low voice, "Miss Beckett, I apologize for calling without warning. I wanted to make sure Calloway didn't give you any trouble after you left." Emma came down off the porch. "He didn't," she said. "He seemed more interested in forgetting the whole thing happened." "That sounds like Sela's. He did not get down from his horse," she noticed. "He was waiting to be invited or not." "I saw Ferris riding east when I left," he said. "Toward your property." She frowned. "I did not see him. He might have turned off, just wanted to mention it." He looked at the valley, at the creek, at the barn with its patched roof. "Nice piece of land," he said, and it did not sound like flattery. It sounded like assessment, the kind of thing a person said when they understood land. "It was my father's," she said. "It's mine now." He looked at her then, and something in his expression shifted slightly, became attentive in a way that she felt rather than saw. "I know," he said. "Amos Beckett. I heard he passed. I'm sorry for it." "Did you know him?" "Met him once. At the trading post, ironically enough. He was arguing with Calloway about the price of nails." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. He had strong opinions about nails. Emma felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was tight. "He had strong opinions about everything," she said. "The best ones usually do." He settled his hat. "Well, I just wanted to check. Good evening, Miss Beckett." "Wait," she said before she had entirely decided to say it. He stopped. "Would you like to come in for coffee? You rode this way. It seems the least I can offer." He considered this for a moment with the same calm deliberateness he seemed to bring to all things. "I don't want to trouble you," he said. "You didn't trouble me today," she said. "You helped me. Coffee is not much, but it's what I have." He got down from his horse then, and she saw again just how large he was. He stood a full head taller than she did and was built, as she thought again, like something that belonged to the mountain country, enormous and solid and easy in its own skin. He tied his horse at the post by the porch and followed her inside, ducking slightly through the doorway. Her kitchen was small and warm. She kept it clean, and she had a few things on the shelves that were hers entirely. A small painted tin from somewhere back east that had been her mother's, a bundle of dried wildflowers from the creek bank, a book she had read so many times the spine had cracked and been glued back together with pine pitch. He noticed the book. She saw his eyes go to it, but he did not comment. He sat at the small table with the careful deliberateness of a large man who had learned to be cautious with other people's furniture. She made coffee on the iron stove and brought it to the table, and they sat across from each other in the warm kitchen while the light outside went from orange to purple to the deep velvet dark of a Colorado mountain summer night. "Marshall Hale," she said, tasting the name. "You trap up in the high country." "I do," he said. "Beaver mostly, some elk in the fall. I come down to Durango to trade maybe 4 or 5 times a year." "Where do you live?" "About 30 miles north and east," he said. "Up above the tree line for most of the summer. I have a cabin there, it's comfortable enough." "Alone?" "Alone," he said, without apparent sadness or apology about it. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What made you step in today, at the post?" He thought about this with that characteristic quiet deliberateness before answering. "Calloway's been doing that for years," he said, "charging women and settlers more than he charges men he knows. It's not right, and nobody says so because he's the only game in town." He looked at her, and Ferris was standing there grinning like something that had just cornered a mouse. "I am not a mouse," she said, and it came out with more heat than she intended. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "you're not," and there was something in his voice that was not flattery and was not condescension. It was simply recognition. But 2 against 1 with nowhere else to go isn't a fair situation, even for someone who isn't a mouse. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "I should have said it at the trading post. I wanted to. You were in a conversation and I didn't want to interrupt. You don't have to thank me for that." "I want to," she said firmly. "So accept it." Another corner of the mouth movement, a little bigger this time. "Accepted," he said. They talked for another hour. She had not expected to. She asked him about the mountains, about what they looked like from up high in summer, about whether it was true that the high alpine meadows were full of wildflowers. He told her about the meadows, and about the way the peaks looked at dawn when the first light hit the snowfields and turned them pink and gold. And he talked about these things in the spare, precise way of a man who did not see the need for decoration when the plain truth was already beautiful. She found herself leaning slightly forward across the table without realizing it. He told her about coming west from Pennsylvania 12 years ago, when he was 21, following the mountains because the East had felt too contained. He had trapped and hunted and guided for survey parties, and once briefly worked for a mining outfit before deciding that being underground was not something his nature was built for. He had found his valley and his cabin 3 years ago and had stayed. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about her father's particular genius with growing things, and his corresponding genius for arguing with absolutely anyone about absolutely anything. She told him about learning to read from her mother, who had died when Emma was 9, and about reading every book within reach since then, including the agricultural pamphlets from the territorial government, which she admitted were not very gripping but were useful. He laughed at that. It was a quiet laugh, mostly breath, but it reached his eyes and changed them, and Emma felt the warmth of it like something physical. When he finally stood to go, the hour was later than either of them had planned for. He thanked her for the coffee and picked up his hat from the nail by the door. At the threshold he paused and looked back at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I'll be down in Durango again in about 3 weeks," he said. "If you need anything from the trading post, I'd be glad to come by." She understood what he was really offering, company on the errand, a presence that would make Calloway and Ferris both think twice. She understood that and she appreciated it. But she was also aware that she wanted him to come back for a reason that had nothing to do with Sila's Calloway. "I might," she said. "I'll likely need more canvas." He nodded. 3 weeks then," he said, and went out into the dark, and she listened to the sound of his horse moving back up the trail until it disappeared into the quiet. She stood at the door for a while after he was gone. She was smiling, she noticed. She was not sure the last time she had done that without working at it. The 3 weeks passed as 3 weeks do when a person is waiting for something. Slowly and also very quickly. Emma worked the homestead and patched the barn roof with the canvas she had bought and weeded the kitchen garden and turned the pigs out to root in the south field and tried not to count the days. She also, without entirely admitting to herself what she was doing, spent 2 evenings mending a blue dress she had not worn since the previous autumn, straightening the hem and replacing 2 buttons that had gone dull with bright brass ones she found in the button tin her mother had left behind. She thought about Marshall Hale with a regularity that she tried to find embarrassing but could not quite manage. She thought about the way he had simply stepped between her and that situation at the trading post, quietly, without fanfare, the way a mountain puts itself between the wind and the valley below it, not making a performance of protection, but simply being solid in the right place. She thought about his hands around the coffee cup. She thought about the way he listened, fully and without apparent impatience, as though what she said was exactly what he was interested in hearing. She had not had many people in her life who listened like that. She was out at the creek on the morning of the 20th day, drawing water, when she heard a horse on the trail and looked up to see him coming down from the north on the big roan, and she felt something lift in her chest that she recognized now, even if she was not entirely ready to name it. He raised a hand when he saw her and she raised one back, and he came down to the creek and got off his horse and picked up one of the buckets and helped her carry the water back to the house without being asked, as naturally as though he had been doing it for years. "You're early," she said. "Finished what I needed to finish," he said. "Figured I'd ride down." He glanced at the barn. "Your canvas held." "It held," she said. "It's still the east corner that's the trouble, but I'll get to it." "I can look at it if you like," he said. She almost said you do not need to, which was the thing she always said when anyone offered anything, the reflexive, trained politeness of a woman who had learned early to manage her own needs. She stopped herself and said instead, "I'd appreciate that." He spent the better part of 2 hours on the barn, during which she brought him water and watched him work with a helpless and somewhat irritating admiration, because he was good at it. He had the kind of practical competence that people who lived by their hands in hard country developed out of necessity, the ability to look at a problem, understand it completely, and solve it with whatever was available. When he was done, the east corner was better braced, and the canvas was resecured, and he had also, somewhat quietly, replaced 2 fence boards on the barn's south side that she had noticed but had not yet gotten around to. She made him lunch, which he ate with the same uncomplicated appreciation he brought to everything, and then they sat on the porch in the afternoon warmth, and she asked him about the winter up in the high country, which he said was hard but manageable if a man was prepared, which he always was. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked, and then felt immediately that she should not have, because it was too close to something personal. But he considered it the way he considered everything, without deflection. "Sometimes," he said, "more than I used to lately." He looked at her when he said it. She looked back at him. "I find I think about the valley a great deal," he said carefully. The lower country, she said. "This particular part of it," he said. She felt the warmth in her face and was glad the afternoon light was bright enough to excuse it. "You should come down again," she said, "when you have cause." "I'll need cause," he agreed, and his tone was so perfectly even that she could not tell if he was teasing her or entirely serious, and she suspected it was both. He went into Durango the next morning, and she rode in with him, which had not been her original plan, but which she had been moving toward for the better part of a week without admitting it. They rode side by side on the 12-mile trail, and she discovered that he was good company at a pace as well as at a table, easy in his silence and interesting when he spoke, pointing out a red-tailed hawk working the updraft above the eastern ridge, and telling her something about the way hawks read thermals that she had not known and found she very much wanted to know. At the trading post, Calloway was notably attentive. He did not attempt any price games. He was, in fact, almost gracious in the way of a man who has made a calculation. Emma noted it without comment. Marshall bought what he needed, she bought her canvas, and when Doyle Ferris appeared in the doorway and took in the sight of the two of them standing at the counter together, something moved across his sharp face, an adjustment, a reassessment, and he nodded politely and left without coming inside. Emma and Marshall ate lunch at the small eating house on the main street, which served a decent beef stew and bread that was fresh on Tuesdays, which it was. They sat at a table by the window and watched the town go by outside and talked about everything and nothing, about the territorial government's plans for a railroad spur, about the growing season and what the rains were doing, about a book she mentioned that he had actually read, which surprised and delighted her. "You read," she said. "I read," he confirmed. "A man has evenings up in the high country. What else is there to do with them? I didn't expect it." "What did you expect?" She considered him across the table. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I think I expected someone who lived as you do to be a certain way, quieter than you are, less curious." "I'm curious about a great many things," he said, and the way he said it with that quiet, steady attention fixed on her made the words carry considerably more than their plain meaning. She looked down at her bread and tore a piece of it and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble, in the best possible way. He rode back with her in the afternoon, and this time when he reached the edge of her property he got down from his horse without being invited, and they sat on the porch again, while the sun did its Colorado evening display across the western sky, and he stayed until the stars came out and she brought a blanket from inside because the mountain air at night, even in summer, carried the memory of snow in it. He left when the moon was well up, and she watched him ride north into the silver dark, and she knew, standing on her porch with the blanket around her shoulders and the creek murmuring away in the dark, that she was in love with this man. She had not done the thing slowly or carefully, the way she did most things. It had simply happened the way weather happened without asking permission. She was not sorry about it. She was, in fact, deeply and somewhat terrifyingly glad. Marshall Hale rode north through the mountain dark and thought about Emma Beckett for the entire 30 miles, which was both the best and the most distracting ride he had made in years. He had not come south with any intention of this. He had come south because of what had happened at the trading post, because he had stood in the back of that room and watched Calloway and Ferris working on her, two men with gravity and advantage on their side, and something in him had not been willing to stand there and watch it happen without saying something. He had not thought of it as bravery. He had simply thought of it as the thing that was right to do. He had not expected to end up at a small kitchen table in the blue Colorado dark, drinking the best coffee he had tasted in 2 years, and talking with someone who met him fully in every direction he moved, who was curious and direct and funny in a dry, quiet way that sneaked up on him, who had a spine like ironwood under all that soft-voiced politeness. He had not expected to want to come back the next morning and the morning after that, but he did want it. He wanted it the way he had wanted the mountain country when he was 21 and locked inside the East, with an urgency that made perfect sense to him even as it surprised him. He was back at the homestead inside of 2 weeks. He told himself it was because he had found some shingles in Durango that would be better for her barn roof than canvas, and brought them along, which was true. He told himself he was riding by anyway, which was not true. He told himself he was simply neighborly by nature, which was true in general, and in this specific case was the tail end of a much longer explanation. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt between rows of beans with her bonnet pushed back and her sleeves rolled up, and she looked up when his shadow fell across her, and her face did the thing he had been thinking about for 2 weeks, that small, involuntary brightening that she had not yet learned to suppress, and that he hoped she never would. "Shingles," he said, by way of explanation, lifting them down from where they were tied to his pack horse. "Of course," she said gravely, and stood up and brushed dirt from her hands, and she was clearly trying not to smile and failing at it. He fixed the barn roof properly that afternoon. She worked in the garden and then came to hand him things when he needed them, and at some point they fell into a rhythm of this, her anticipating what he would need before he asked for it, which made the work go faster and also made it harder to concentrate, which was a new problem for him. That evening he told her about a story he had heard from a Ute man he sometimes traded with near the high country, about the way the mountains were made, and she listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, completely absorbed, and asked questions afterward that were so precisely aimed at the interesting parts of the story that he started laughing. "What?" she said. "You're the most interested person I have ever met," he said. She considered this. "Is that a problem?" "Not remotely," he said. It became clear over the following weeks that Marshall Hale was not going back to 30 miles north and staying there. He made the ride down more and more often, sometimes staying 2 or 3 days, sleeping in the barn with his bedroll, which he did without comment, and she did not insist otherwise because she understood both the propriety of it and the fact that he was not the kind of man who needed to be managed on such things. He knew what was right and he did it. He helped her with the wheat harvest. He had never grown wheat and she had not thought to ask him, but he showed up on the first morning of harvest with his sleeves rolled up and his hair tied back with a strip of leather, which was a detail she tried not to be as aware of as she was, and he learned how she did things by watching and then did them that way, which was a quality she found almost irrational in its appeal. In the evenings they sat on the porch or at the table. She read to him sometimes, and he listened with his eyes on the middle distance, not daydreaming but processing, and when she finished, he would say something about the passage that was so unexpected and so right that she would put the book down and look at him. On a particularly warm August evening with the creek running loud and the first stars appearing over the eastern ridge, he told her he had been thinking about staying in the valley. She was very still. "Not the high country," he said. "The valley, this valley." He looked at the homestead, at the garden, at the mountains on all sides. "It's a good place, good land, good water." He paused. "Good company." Emma looked at her hands. "Marshall," she said. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to." He stopped. Started again, more carefully, in that way he had when he wanted to say something exactly right. "I know this is your land, your father's land and yours now. I'm not suggesting anything about that. I'm just telling you where I find myself wanting to be." She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the full, steady attention that she had come to understand was simply how he engaged with things that mattered to him, and she realized that she had become something that mattered to him, and that this was not frightening to her the way she had always assumed it might be when such a thing happened. "I find myself wanting you here," she said. The words came out simply and plainly, the way his words always did, and she was glad for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she felt the warmth and size of his hand around hers and the slight roughness of his palm, and thought that she had never felt anything quite so right in her life. "Emma," he said, just that. Her name in his voice, which was a full sentence if you listened to it properly. "Yes," she said, which was also everything. They sat there as the stars multiplied across the sky, his hand around hers, the creek running in the dark below, the mountains on every side enormous and settled and patient, and it was one of those moments that a person carries for the rest of their life, knowing even while it is happening that it is something they will not forget. The matter of Doyle Ferris did not resolve itself quietly. It rarely did with men like Ferris. 3 days after that evening on the porch, Ferris rode up to the homestead in the middle of the afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands behind him. Emma saw them coming from the kitchen window and went to the door and stood in it with her arms folded, which was her version of a fortified position. Ferris stopped his horse at the property line, which he had apparently decided was the line he needed to negotiate his way across. "Emma," he said, in that infuriating pleasant tone, "been meaning to have a talk with you." "Then talk," she said. He looked at the barn with its new shingles, at the garden, at the evidence of recent work everywhere. "Someone's been helping you," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have friends," she said, "mountain man kind of friends." He said it with a smile that was designed to be dismissive and landed about a foot short of its target. "What did you want, Mr. Ferris?" He settled in his saddle. I'm willing to offer you considerably more for this property than I offered last spring, he said. Enough to set you up somewhere comfortable, in town maybe, or back east if that's what you want. I don't want town, she said, and I don't want back east. I want this. Emma, you're a single woman out here alone, and she is not alone. Marshall came out from behind the barn where he had been working on a fence post. He had heard the horses and come around without hurry, which was its own statement. He stood between the barn and the house with his arms loose at his sides, and even from a distance Emma could see the way the two ranch hands behind Ferris reassessed the situation. Ferris looked at Marshall. Marshall looked at Ferris. "This doesn't concern you," Ferris said. "Miss Beckett's welfare concerns me a great deal," Marshall said with perfect civility. There was a long silence. One of the ranch hands behind Ferris shifted his weight and his horse shifted with him, and the sound of the bridle was very loud in the quiet. "She'll sell eventually," Ferris said. "Women always do, alone out here." "This woman won't," Marshall said. "But I'll be sure to let her speak for herself on that." He looked at Emma. "I won't," she said clearly. Another silence. Ferris looked between them, and the calculation in his eyes was running at full speed, adding up what was in front of him, and the sum he arrived at was apparently not in his favor. "We'll see," he said finally, which was the last refuge of a man who has run out of better options, and he turned his horse and his men followed him, and they rode back west at a pace that was deliberately unhurried, which was its own kind of retreat. Emma let out a long breath. Marshall came up onto the porch and stood beside her, watching Ferris go. "He'll try something else," she said. "Probably," Marshall agreed. "But he's not stupid. He'll try things that are within the law and will handle those within the law." She thought. He had said it without hesitation. "Marshall," she said. "Emma," he said. She turned to him. He was very close, which in the narrow space of her porch and given his general size was simply how things worked, but she was also aware that it was not only geography bringing them close. He was looking at her with that direct, full attention, and she could see that he was thinking about the same thing she was thinking about. She took a step toward him and put her hand on his chest, feeling the warmth of him through the flannel shirt, the solid reality of him, and he put his hand over hers, and then his other arm came around her, and she was suddenly against him, which was not the smallest of experiences because he was so very large, but it was the most comfortable thing she could remember, the most held she had felt in a very long time. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She felt his breath in her hair. "I am not going anywhere," he said, low and quiet and certain, "unless you send me away." "I am not going to do that," she said. "Then we're settled on that," he said. She laughed against his chest, and she felt him laugh too, and they stood there on the porch of the Beckett homestead in the afternoon sun, while the mountains rose on every side, and a hawk turned slow circles above the eastern ridge. And Emma thought that this was what it felt like when a life that had been getting along just fine finally came into its full and proper shape. The question of their future was settled, as far as Emma and Marshall were concerned, somewhere around the end of September, when the aspens had gone gold across the hillsides, and the air had turned sharp with the first real breath of autumn. It was settled in the way that things are settled between two people who understand each other without a great deal of excess ceremony, during a conversation on the porch that began with him asking whether she planned to stay through the winter alone, and ended with him asking whether she would consider marrying him. He asked it the way he did most things, with that direct, undecorated certainty, looking at her with those hazel eyes and not performing anything, simply asking the actual question. "I've been thinking about it for longer than is probably practical," he said. "I know it's quick by most measures." "It's not quick," she said. "It's honest." He nodded. "I want to be where you are. I want to build something with you. I want this valley and this land and this life, and I want it with you in it." He paused. "I'm asking properly. I know what I'm asking." Emma looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the day at the trading post, the quiet way he had stepped between her and everything that had been pressing in on her from two sides. She thought about the long evenings and the barn shingles and the way he listened. She thought about how she had felt standing on this porch watching him ride north in the moonlight, and how she had known then. Yes, she said, the same yes as before. He smiled at her, fully this time, a real one, and it rearranged his entire face, and she thought she could probably look at that smile for the rest of her life without getting tired of it. They were married in November, in the small church that had been built that spring at the edge of Durango, by the Methodist minister who had come west from Ohio and was still somewhat adjusting to the altitude. The ceremony was modest and warm, witnessed by a handful of people from the valley and a few from town, including the woman who ran the eating house where Emma and Marshall had eaten their first lunch together, who cried through the entire thing and apologized for it not even slightly. Calloway showed up at the back of the church and sat in the last pew, which Emma noticed and decided to accept as the neighborly gesture it was meant to be. Ferris did not come, and she did not expect him to. Emma wore the blue dress with the brass buttons and had wildflowers from the creek braided into her hair, and Marshall wore a dark coat she had not seen before and looked profoundly uncomfortable in it, until she told him he looked wonderful, at which point he looked somewhat less uncomfortable but remained clearly in favor of returning to flannel at the earliest opportunity. The minister pronounced them married and Marshall kissed her, and she heard the woman from the eating house make a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a cheer, and she laughed against his mouth and he laughed too, and that was the beginning. The winter of 1882 going into 1883 was a hard one in Colorado, as mountain winters were, with snow piling up to the window ledges by January and the creek freezing to silence. Marshall had come prepared for it, which meant the woodpile was stacked 8 feet high before Christmas, and the root cellar was full, and the animals were comfortable, and he had made, over the autumn months, a number of modifications to the house that made it warmer and tighter against the wind, which was the mountain country wind, opinionated and persistent. They were not miserable about the snow. They were, in fact, fairly wonderful about it. The long evenings of a Colorado winter gave them something that neither of them had expected, which was enormous amounts of time in a small, warm space, and they used it as two people in love will use such time. With considerable enthusiasm, and also considerable conversation, and also the reading of books and the playing of cards, and the telling of stories, and the occasional fierce debate about things like whether the territory ought to apply for statehood, or whether the beaver population in the high country was recovering, or whether the beef stew was better with or without the turnip, a question on which they disagreed with a cheerfulness that made the disagreement more of a pleasure than a problem. Emma discovered in that winter that Marshall had a quiet, dry humor that came out fully in private, that he was a careful and patient teacher when it came to the practical skills she had not yet acquired, that he slept with the solid completeness of a man who had no unresolved business with his conscience, and that he was, in the cold mountain dark, the warmest person she had ever been near. She also discovered in March that they were expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday evening while they were doing the dishes, because she had not been able to think of a more dramatic moment to do it, and the information was pressing on her from the inside and needed to come out. She simply said it. He went very still, standing at the basin with a plate in his hands, and then he set the plate down very carefully and turned to her. "In the fall," he said. "October, I think," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her, very gently, as though she had become something precious, which she had always been to him, but which she understood she was now being assigned an additional category of, and she felt him press his face into her hair and hold her, and his arms were shaking slightly, and this from a man who had faced down grizzly bears and spring floods without apparent trembling. "Marshall," she said softly. "Give me a moment," he said, muffled in her hair. She gave him a moment, several of them. "Good," she said. He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were bright, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before, entirely unguarded, completely open, the face of a man in the full reach of his happiness. "Good," he said. "Emma, good does not begin to cover it." Spring came to the valley the way it always came to high country, slowly and then all at once, with snowmelt running every creek past its banks and the hillsides turning green almost overnight, and the birds coming back in staggering numbers and the air losing its iron cold and becoming something gentler and full of possibility. Marshall planted the south field with her in May, which had previously been one of Emma's least favorite tasks, because doing it alone was backbreaking, and the results were never quite right when she did not have enough hands. With Marshall, it became something else entirely. They worked side by side through the long spring days, and he was indefatigable, and she matched his pace as best she could, with the practical consideration that she was now visibly expecting, and had adjusted her range of motion accordingly. And at noon, they sat under the cottonwood by the creek and ate lunch together and watched the water go by. It was one of those times that should perhaps have been ordinary but was not. It was not ordinary at all. It was, she thought, the best version of a life she had ever imagined having. Doyle Ferris tried one more time in June. He came with a lawyer from Durango and papers that were designed to suggest some irregularity in the original land claim. And Emma and Marshall sat across from them both at the kitchen table, and were very polite and very calm and very thorough. Marshall had spent 2 days in Durango the previous month visiting the land office and the territorial records, just to be sure everything about the Beckett claim was correctly filed and documented, because he was a man who believed in being prepared, and it turned out this preparation was warranted. The lawyer looked at the documents Marshall placed on the table, looked at Ferris, and said something quietly to him that Emma could not hear. Ferris left without the outcome he had come for, and the lawyer was very polite on his way out, and that was the last time Doyle Ferris came to the Beckett homestead. He sold his cattle operation the following year and moved to Santa Fe, and nobody in the valley missed him particularly. On a cold and warm afternoon in the 3rd week of October, 1883, Emma delivered their son. The midwife from Durango had come out 4 days earlier, a capable woman named Mrs. Harlow, who had delivered more than half the children born in the valley, and who was briskly reassuring about everything in a way that Emma found genuinely comforting. Marshall sat outside the bedroom door for 6 hours during the labor, and Emma could hear him getting up and sitting down and getting up again, which was funny to her in retrospect, and not funny at all while it was happening. And when she heard his son's first cry come through the door, she heard Marshall make a sound on the other side of it that was not a word, but was the most eloquent thing she had ever heard him say. Mrs. Harlow opened the door and Marshall came in. He looked at Emma first, the thorough, searching look of a man making sure the person he loves most is all right, and when she gave him a tired and genuine smile, his shoulders came down from wherever they had been for the last 6 hours. Then he looked at the bundle she was holding and went very still again, the way he had gone still in the kitchen in March, and he came to the side of the bed and sat down carefully, and Emma lifted the bundle toward him. "Thomas," she said. They had chosen the name together, her father's middle name and also the name of Marshall's younger brother back in Pennsylvania, whom he had not seen in 11 years but thought of often. Marshall took his son with the exaggerated care of a very large man holding something very small, and Thomas Hale looked up at his father with the unfocused, ancient-seeming eyes of the very newly born, and Marshall looked back at him with everything he was, completely visible, not hidden at all. "Hello," he said softly to his son. "I've been waiting to meet you." Thomas made a sound that could have been many things. Emma reached up and put her hand on Marshall's arm, and he turned to her with those bright hazel eyes, and she thought she had never loved anyone as much as she loved this man, this enormous, solid, quiet man who had walked into a trading post one morning and decided that what was happening in the corner was not right and had simply, without fanfare, done something about it. "Thank you," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "For what specifically?" "For the flower," she said. He laughed, full and warm, and Thomas startled slightly at the sound, and then settled back into his father's arms with the complete trust of a creature who has no reason yet to doubt the world. And Emma watched the two of them and felt a joy so complete and so uncomplicated that it required no words at all to contain it. In the years that followed, the valley around the Beckett homestead changed and grew and became something more established. Durango itself grew considerably, which was the nature of the territory in those years, and a proper general store came in and gave Calloway some genuine competition, which had a beneficial effect on his pricing habits. A school opened 3 miles from the homestead in 1885, taught by a young woman named Miss Orchard from Denver, who was both excellent at her work and entirely undaunted by the altitude or the winters. And Thomas Hale, who was 2 years old that autumn and already showing signs of his mother's focused curiosity and his father's calm certainty, would eventually make good use of that school. Marshall never went back to the high country for longer than a week at a time after the first winter of their marriage. He had not consciously made the decision to give it up. He had simply found that the thing that had drawn him to the high country, the clean isolation, the simplicity of a life reduced to its most essential elements, was present in the valley too, in a form he had not expected, present in the work of the homestead and the company of his wife and the extraordinary fact of his growing child, and that he preferred it here. He still went up sometimes in late summer for a few days, and he always came back with something for Emma, a particular stone he had found on a high ridge, a handful of the alpine wildflowers she had asked him about that first evening in the kitchen, dried carefully and wrapped in paper. She kept them in the tin on the kitchen shelf that had been her mother's, and eventually the tin was full of them, small pieces of the high world he brought down for her. He had built on to the house by the spring of 1884, adding 2 more rooms, because the single room they were squeezed into with Thomas was workable but not optimal, and because Marshall had, in the way of men who do things properly, decided that if he was going to add rooms, he was going to add the right number of rooms for the family they were building. Emma had not asked how many rooms that was, because she trusted his arithmetic. 2 years after Thomas, a second son was born, a roaring, cheerful boy they called James, who came into the world considerably less patient about the process than his older brother had been, and who, from his first weeks of life, displayed a physical boldness that made his enormous father both proud and carefully watchful. James was followed 3 years later, in 1888, by a daughter they named Clara, who arrived in autumn like her brother Thomas, and who from the beginning had the dark auburn hair and the gray-blue eyes that were entirely her mother's. Marshall held Clara on his first evening with her the way he had held Thomas, with that enormous, careful tenderness, and looked at her for a long time in silence while Emma rested, and the house settled around them in the Colorado autumn dark. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like herself," Emma said, which was the right answer, and Marshall smiled at her the way he always smiled at the right answers. The homestead had become by then a proper working farm, with the wheat acreage expanded, and a small apple orchard that Marshall had planted the spring after Thomas was born, and which had taken 4 years to produce its first real harvest, and which was now, in 1888, giving them more apples than they could use, which Emma had solved by selling them at the Durango market, and using the money to buy the proper iron cook stove she had wanted since 1882. Emma ran the household and the kitchen garden and the market sales, and Marshall ran the fields and the animals and the structural maintenance of the buildings. And in practice, these divisions were fairly theoretical because each of them did whatever needed doing whenever it needed doing. And what that looked like in the daily reality of the homestead was 2 people in motion around each other like the components of a well-made clock, purposeful and in sync. They argued sometimes, as people who are genuinely and deeply invested in the same things will argue. They argued about the best way to manage the South Field when it started showing some drainage problems in 1886, and Emma was right about it, but it took him 2 weeks to admit it, which she enjoyed rather more than was strictly gracious. They argued about whether James should be allowed to go with Marshall to trade in Durango at age 4, and Marshall was right about this one, but Emma held out for a while before conceding. They had a fairly spirited disagreement in 1887 about whether to take out a loan from the bank in Durango to buy the adjacent 60 acres that had come available when its owner moved on, and Marshall was in favor of it, and Emma had a deep, principled resistance to debt that was the inheritance of a woman who had grown up watching the wrong kind of reliance. They talked about it for 3 evenings and eventually arrived at a plan that was Emma's in its caution and Marshall's in its scope, and they bought 40 of the 60 acres outright with what they had saved and took a loan for the remaining 20, which was paid off in 2 years. The 60 acres of additional land gave them room to expand the wheat operation significantly, and by 1890, the Hale homestead was one of the better producing farms in the valley, with a reputation for consistent yield and fair dealing that Marshall had partly built by being the kind of man who kept his word without requiring it to be written down, and Emma had partly built by being the kind of woman who knew the price of everything and the value of more things than that. Thomas, who was 7 in 1890, had begun helping with the lighter farm work in the mornings before school, and had his mother's love of books and his father's ability to work without complaint and be curious about the world at the same time. He followed Marshall around the fields in the evenings asking questions about the soil and the water and the way the mountains caught the weather, and Marshall answered every question with the same full attention he gave to everything his wife said, because it was the same impulse, the belief that the things that mattered to the people he loved deserved his complete and honest consideration. James, at 5, was more interested in the horses than in the wheat, and had already informed his father that he intended to have the fastest horse in the territory, which Marshall had accepted with appropriate gravity. Clara, just 2, was primarily interested in the chickens, whose names she was learning with an absorption that reminded Emma painfully and happily of herself at that age. One particular evening in the autumn of 1890, when the harvest was in and the root cellar was full and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the specific warm way that a house is quiet when it is full of sleeping people, Marshall and Emma sat on the porch they had been sitting on since that first evening 8 years ago. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, enormous and permanent and unconcerned, and the creek ran in the dark below, and the air had that smell of late autumn in the mountains, pine and cold earth, and the faint distant smoke of their neighbors' chimneys a few miles off. Emma had her blanket, the same gesture as that first autumn, though the blanket was different now, and she was different, and everything was different except the mountains and the creek and the fact of sitting here with him. He had his arm around her and she was leaned against his side, which she had discovered years ago was one of the best places in the world to be, warm and solid and unhurried. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About how different everything is," she said. "From the day I drove in to buy flour." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about you all the way home that night," he said, "the first night. I rode 30 miles in the dark thinking about a woman who had just told a man twice her age that she was not a mouse." She laughed softly. "I said that with considerably more confidence than I felt." "I know," he said. "That was part of it." She looked up at him in the dark. "You saw me before I saw you," she said. "I walked in and there you were," he said simply, "standing your ground in the corner of Calloway's store with everything pressing in on you and not budging." He paused. "I walked in and there you were." He said the second time the same way he said her name, as a complete sentence. She turned slightly to look at him and he looked back at her, and this moment, like the one 8 years ago on this same porch, was the kind of thing a person carried. She could feel the specific weight of these 8 years between them, the work and the seasons and the 3 children asleep inside, and the land that was theirs and the life they had built from that single moment in a creaking old trading post when a large man with dark hair and steady eyes had stepped quietly between her and everything that was working against her, and changed the direction of everything. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said back without pause in that plain, certain way he had, the way of a man who does not need to perform the things that are simply true. She settled back against him and looked at the stars and felt the blanket around her shoulders and his arm around her and listened to the creek. "The south field is going to need redraining in spring," she said. "I know," he said. "I have a plan," she said. "Of course you do," he said with that warmth in his voice. "Tell me." So she told him. There on the porch under the Colorado stars with the mountains all around them and the children inside and the creek running and the fire going low in the hearth. And he listened the way he always listened, fully and without impatience, and asked good questions and had a few ideas of his own that were good ideas, and they talked it through until they had a plan they both believed in. Which was, she thought, the whole of it. The whole of what a life could be, if it went right. Not the absence of hard things or the guarantee of easy seasons, but this: two people who had found each other in the middle of an ordinary day that had turned out to be extraordinary, who faced the same direction, and worked the same ground and talked about everything, and believed in each other past the point where belief required evidence. She had gone to the trading post for flour and salt pork and canvas and lamp oil. She had come home with the beginning of everything. Clara cried out once from inside the house and then settled back into sleep, and the sound of the creek filled the silence again, and Marshall's arm tightened slightly around Emma's shoulders. Just enough. Just the acknowledgement of the cry and the settling and the ongoing, particular miracle of small sleeping children and the late autumn night and the life they had made together. Emma closed her eyes and listened to his heartbeat under her ear. The San Juan Mountain stood in the dark all around the valley, ancient and enormous and perfectly still, and below them the Hale homestead sat with its good roof and its warm fire and its root cellar full of winter stores and its kitchen shelf with the painted tin and the dried mountain flowers and the book with the cracked spine glued back with pine pitch. And inside the house 3 children slept the uncomplicated sleep of children who have been loved into confidence about the world. And on the porch under the stars, Marshall Hale held Emma Beckett Hale against his side, and she held the blanket around them both, and neither of them moved for a very long time because there was nowhere else they needed to be, and everything they had ever wanted was exactly here. The creek ran on in the dark. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. The mountains kept their ancient, imperturbable watch. And in the morning there would be work, as there always was and always would be. The particular good work of a life that meant something, and they would do it together, as they had from the beginning and would for all the years still coming, shoulder to shoulder in the wide and generous valley, under the great Colorado sky.